Two men are dying on an ice field 200 years before Clarke ever hears the name Tau Volantis, and neither one of them will get to explain why. One of them is buried under snow that came down without warning, the kind of avalanche that does not care about rank or mission or how many years a person spent training for a moment like this one. The other keeps walking anyway, because he has orders, and because the device in his hands is the only thing that still makes any of this feel like it mattered. He finds his commanding officer at the end of that walk. He hands over what he was sent to retrieve. Then his own general raises a weapon and ends him without a word of explanation, wipes the data clean, and turns that same weapon on himself a few seconds later. Nobody on that expedition survives to tell anyone what any of it meant. That silence becomes the foundation everything else in this story gets built on top of. This video is going to trace the third and final chapter of a story that started with a corpse rising off a table on a mining ship and ends with an entire planet nearly dragged into a fate worse than that ship's. Rather than simply retelling the plot beat by beat, we are going to treat this as an investigation into what happens when grief, faith, and institutional secrecy get inherited across generations who never asked to inherit any of it. Along the way, we will use documented psychology around trauma, cult radicalization, and complicated grief to understand why the people in this story keep making the choices they make. Choices that feel senseless on the surface and painfully familiar once you understand what is actually driving them. By the time this ends, you will understand why a war fought over dwindling resources led directly to a religious terrorist attack on a lunar colony, why a soldier who once nearly took his own life became one of the only steady presences left in a dying expedition, and why the ending of this particular story refuses to actually end at all. If something in this video lands for you, drop a comment and let me know what part did. Maybe it is a connection between the story and something real that stuck with you. Maybe it is just a line that got under your skin. If there is a game or a piece of lore you think deserves this kind of treatment, leave that too. I am always looking for the next rabbit hole to fall into. For now, get comfortable. Dim the lights if you have not already. This story does not begin with Clarke standing in his apartment 3 years after the worst thing that ever happened to him. It begins 200 years earlier, on a planet nobody back home had ever heard of, with two men who were never supposed to be the beginning of anything. Chapter 1. Two Men on Ice. Private Sam Ackerman and a soldier named Tim Kaufman were sent down to the surface of Tau Volantis on an assignment that sounded almost routine on paper. Retrieve a device called the Codex from a transport that had gone down in the snow, and deliver it back to a scientist named Dr. William Serrano. Neither man had any real reason to think this mission would end differently than any other. The planet did not agree with that assumption. An avalanche came down on the two of them without warning, burying Ackerman and leaving Kaufman to keep going alone through terrain that punished every step with cold, wind, and snow deep enough to swallow a person to the thigh. Picture what that walk actually felt like. No visibility beyond a few feet in any direction. No way to call for help that would arrive in time to matter. Just one man, carrying something he had been told was important enough to die for, moving through a landscape that seemed actively hostile to anyone trying to cross it. When he finally reached his commanding officer, General Spencer Mahad, Kaufman would have felt something close to relief. He had made it. He had done the job. That relief lasted seconds. Mahad accepted the Codex from Kaufman's hands, then killed him without any explanation offered to the dying man about why. The general wiped the data clean immediately afterward, made certain the mission's records could never be reconstructed, and then turned the same weapon on himself. A mine-laying vessel traveling with the expedition released space mines around the planet soon after, sealing the area off from anyone who might try to return. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it establishes something that repeats across every layer of this story that follows. A soldier followed his orders exactly as given, completed an impossible task under conditions that should have killed him twice over, and was executed the instant he became inconvenient to a larger plan he was never told about. Mahad was not a monster acting alone in that moment. He was carrying out a policy that had been approved somewhere far above his own rank, a policy built around the idea that certain knowledge was more dangerous loose in the world than any individual life was worth protecting. Kaufman's death was not personal. It was procedural. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should, because procedural violence tends to be the kind that never shows up in any official record afterward. Nobody writes a report admitting they executed their own soldier to protect a secret. They simply make sure there is nothing left to report. The order Mahad was following had a name. It was called Scenario 5, and it called for the destruction of every scrap of research, every artifact, and every person who had come into contact with what the Sovereign Colonies had found buried inside that frozen world. All science data gathered on the expedition was to be destroyed. All personnel connected to it were to be executed. Every ship, every vehicle, everything that could carry a trace of what had happened there was to be rendered useless. The purge was so complete that it stripped the Sovereign Colonies of enough soldiers and resources to meaningfully damage their own ability to keep fighting a war they were already losing. And the people who approved it decided that cost was worth paying anyway. Whatever they had found on Tau Volantis frightened them enough that erasing it mattered more than the war itself. That fear deserves a closer look, because it did not come from nowhere. To understand why an entire government would choose to bury a discovery capable of ending an energy crisis and a civil war in the same stroke, you have to go back further than the ice, back to the desperate circumstances that sent anyone to that planet in the first place. Chapter 2. The War That Ate Itself. Long before Tau Volantis entered anyone's vocabulary, humanity's colonies were governed by a body called the Sovereign Colonies, and that government was fighting a war it could not afford to lose, and could not afford to keep fighting either. The Secession War pitted the Sovereign Colonies' armed forces against a movement calling itself the Secessionists, a faction seeking to dissolve the existing administration entirely and separate from the Sovereign Colonies. That conflict did not happen in isolation. It ran alongside a separate, ongoing set of conflicts known as the Resource Wars, fights over dwindling material and energy that were themselves reshaping how desperate every side had become. By the year 2311, the Sovereign Colonies were, by their own admiral's account, out of resources, out of public support, and running out of time. Consider what that combination actually does to a government trying to hold itself together. A war effort that has lost the public's patience cannot simply be ended, because ending it means admitting the sacrifices already made were wasted. It also cannot easily be won, because the resources required to win it have already been spent chasing a victory that keeps receding further away. Leadership caught inside that trap tends to gamble, reaching for anything that promises a way out, even when the odds of that gamble paying off are thin. This is not a pattern unique to a fictional civil war. Failing institutions under sustained resource pressure and eroding legitimacy consistently take on more risk in their final years than they would ever accept during periods of stability, precisely because stability is no longer an option they believe is available to them. The Sovereign Colonies found their gamble almost by accident. Their science division had been experimenting with replicated versions of an artifact recovered from an alien object known as a marker, hoping to understand and eventually harness whatever energy the original object seemed to generate. During that research, they discovered something unexpected. The signal being broadcast by their marker copies was not actually originating from the replicas themselves. It was coming from somewhere out in deep space, and using a research platform called Rosetta Station, they were able to triangulate that signal back to a specific point of origin, a planet nobody had ever charted before, Tau Volantis. To a government already drowning in a war it could not win, this looked like salvation. If the signal really was coming from some kind of source object capable of producing unlimited energy, recovering it could solve the resource crisis driving the resource wars and simultaneously starve the secession war of the scarcity that was fueling it on both sides. The Sovereign Colonies Council, approved a full expedition to the planet, placing Admiral Marjorie Graves in command of the flotilla, General Spencer Mahad in command of the ground forces, and Dr. Earl Serrano in charge of the science division tasked with actually understanding whatever they found. Notice the shape of that decision before moving any further into where it led. A government running out of time chose to gamble an already stretched military and scientific apparatus on the hope of a single, unverified discovery, rather than accepting the slower, more painful path of negotiating an end to a war it was losing. That kind of gamble rarely produces the clean rescue its architects imagine. It tends instead to produce exactly what happened here. A mission that consumed even more of the resources it was meant to save, personnel exposed to something none of them understood, and a secret so dangerous that burying it eventually cost the Sovereign Colonies whatever chance they had left of surviving the war at all. The expedition reached Tau Volantis on the 29th of August, 2311, establishing an initial position on a planet none of them were prepared for. What Serrano's teams found waiting for them beneath the ice would end up mattering far more than the war that sent them there, though almost none of them would live long enough to understand exactly what they had uncovered. Chapter 3. What EarthGov Inherited. The Sovereign Colonies did not survive what happened on Tau Volantis, at least not in any form that continued governing afterward. The purges carried out under Scenario 5 gutted enough of their remaining military strength that the secession war tipped decisively toward the separatists, who seized the resulting power vacuum and established a new Earth-centered government, calling itself the Earth Government Colonial Alliance. History would come to know it simply as EarthGov, and this new administration inherited something it likely never fully understood at the time. Buried somewhere in the wreckage of purged records and destroyed sites was proof that red markers, artificial copies of the original black marker, were real, were man-made, and were capable of producing the kind of horror that had already justified an entire government executing its own people to keep quiet. EarthGov did not simply let that knowledge stay buried. Rather than abandoning the research entirely, the new government quietly resumed it, establishing a network of secured marker test labs scattered across multiple colonies, each one housing a red marker under tightly controlled conditions and studying it away from public view. Colonies like Uxor and lunar settlements like New Horizons each hosted their own version of this program, treating the artifacts less like a closed chapter of history and more like an ongoing scientific asset too valuable to walk away from, no matter how many warnings the past had already provided. There is something worth naming here about how institutions handle inherited danger. An organization that stumbles onto a catastrophic discovery for the first time can plausibly claim ignorance about the risks involved. An organization that picks that same discovery back up after watching its predecessor collapse under the weight of it forfeits that excuse entirely. EarthGov knew, at some level, that whatever these artifacts were capable of had already destroyed the government that came before it. They pursued the research anyway, choosing the same gamble that had already failed once, simply because the potential payoff still looked too valuable to leave on the table. This is a documented pattern across real-world institutions that inherit dangerous knowledge from a predecessor. Awareness of a prior catastrophe rarely produces caution proportional to the risk. More often, it produces confidence that this time, with better containment and tighter secrecy, the outcome will be different. That confidence is almost never earned, and it almost never holds. Word of these test labs eventually reached people well outside EarthGov's control, and one particular sect within an already unusual religion took that discovery as confirmation of something they had believed for a long time. Their government, in their eyes, had committed exactly the kind of heresy their prophet once died trying to expose. What began as quiet outrage inside a fringe religious community would, over the following years, curdle into something willing to kill for its beliefs. That transformation belongs to a later chapter of this story, but its roots start here, in a secret EarthGov chose to keep pursuing, rather than let stay buried. For now, the more immediate consequence of that secrecy plays out somewhere much smaller and much more personal than a government program. 3 years after surviving a catastrophe most people never even heard the full truth about. One engineer is sitting alone in an apartment, doing everything he can to disappear from a world that has already taken almost everything from him once. Chapter 4. The Man Who Kept Surviving. Isaac Clarke had spent 3 years hiding from EarthGov by the time this part of the story picks up, and hiding, in his case, meant something closer to disappearing than simply staying quiet. After surviving the horror aboard a station called the Sprawl, Isaac had become a name EarthGov associated with catastrophe, unrest, and a religious movement they were actively trying to suppress. Rather than being treated as a survivor, he had become a liability to be watched, which meant the safest version of a life left available to him was one spent avoiding attention entirely. Picture what 3 years of that kind of isolation actually does to a person who has already survived 2 mass casualty events involving reanimated corpses and a cult willing to sacrifice anything for its beliefs. Isaac was not living during those years so much as enduring them, carrying an accumulation of loss that had never really been processed, only outrun. His relationship with a woman named Ellie Langford, someone he had grown close to during the Sprawl outbreak and who he had continued a relationship with afterward, had come apart under circumstances neither of them had fully resolved. The most recent contact he received from her before this story restarts was a message telling him she was moving on. Whatever that phrase meant to her, to Isaac it would have landed as one more door quietly closing on whatever stability he had left. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that develops in survivors who go straight from acute crisis into prolonged isolation without ever getting a real chance to recover in between. Clinical research on trauma consistently finds that recovery depends heavily on stable relationships and a sense of safety in the aftermath, the very things a person forced into hiding is least able to access. Isaac had neither. He had a name that made him dangerous to be near, a government that treated his survival as a threat rather than a triumph, and a relationship that had quietly dissolved somewhere in the space between 2 disasters. Whatever version of Isaac Clarke had once been capable of holding a conversation, building something with his hands, or trusting the people around him, 3 years of that isolation had worn a great deal of it away. That isolation ended the moment 2 men forced their way into his apartment. One was a captain named Robert Norton, the other a sergeant named John Carver, and neither of them had come simply to check on an old acquaintance. They arrived carrying a request from Ellie, who needed Isaac's help with a mission connected to the very artifacts he had spent 3 years trying to put behind him. Before Isaac could fully process what they were asking of him, the colony around them came under direct assault. A radical branch of the Unitologist faith, a group calling itself the Circle, launched an attack on New Horizons' lunar colony specifically to reach him, tearing through defenses with a level of coordination that suggested this was no spontaneous riot. It was a hunt, and Isaac Clarke was the target. In the chaos that followed, the 3 men were separated, and Isaac found himself face to face for the first time with the man behind that hunt, a Unitologist leader named Jacob Danick, who forced Isaac to watch as he tore open the containment surrounding the colony's marker test lab, unleashing exactly the kind of outbreak EarthGov's secrecy had spent years trying to prevent anyone from ever witnessing again. What was supposed to be a quiet request for help from an old friend had, within minutes, become the opening act of a war that had been building since the moment EarthGov decided the marker program was worth resuming. Understanding why Danick was willing to unleash that kind of devastation to reach one engineer requires stepping back from the chaos of that colony assault and asking a harder question. What actually turns a person into someone capable of that? The answer has less to do with Danick personally, and more to do with a psychological pattern that shows up again and again in real-world radical movements. A pattern this story is about to walk through in far more detail than any summary of plot events could capture on its own. Chapter 5. The Bracelet and the Distance. To understand why Isaac and Ellie's relationship fell apart the way it did, it helps to look at a small detail that meant more than it seemed to at the time. During the outbreak on the Sprawl, Ellie wore a bracelet on her right arm, one etched with a single word written in marker symbols: life. She stopped wearing it by the time the events of this story begin. A detail that small rarely gets included in a story without carrying some weight, and this one carries quite a bit once you understand the 2 years standing between those 2 points. Ellie had already survived one catastrophic loss before she ever met Isaac. As a heavy equipment pilot, she had lost an entire team of her own during the outbreak, forced into decisions no training program prepares a person for, decisions that left her wary of trusting anyone new for a long time afterward. When she and Isaac finally crossed paths on the sprawl, what grew between them was built on top of shared survival, the kind of bond that forms quickly and intensely between two people who have just watched the same nightmare from the same angle. Bonds formed under those conditions tend to feel unbreakable in the moment they are made. They are also, according to research on relationships that begin during acute crisis, some of the hardest to sustain once the crisis itself has passed, and ordinary daily life starts asking questions the emergency never had time for. Here is the difficulty specific to Isaac and Ellie's situation. Isaac's survival had come at a cost that never stopped accumulating. He had watched Nicole, the woman he loved before any of this began, become something the marker used against him for the length of an entire disaster. A hallucination wearing a dead woman's voice that guided, tormented, and eventually confessed the truth of her own death to him in the worst possible way. Carrying that kind of loss into a new relationship changes what a person is capable of offering the people closest to them. Ellie, for her part, needed someone willing to keep moving forward with her, to keep believing there was still a mission worth finishing, still a threat worth confronting head-on. Isaac, understandably, wanted the opposite. He wanted to be done. He wanted a version of life that did not require him to keep walking directly back into the kind of horror that had already cost him everything once. That disagreement is not petty, and it is not shallow, even though on its surface it might look like a simple case of one partner wanting to move on faster than the other. What it actually reflects is two trauma responses pulling in opposite directions. Some survivors of extreme events cope by staying engaged with the danger, working to understand it, confront it, and eventually master it well enough that it no longer holds power over them. Others cope by withdrawing entirely, seeking distance and normalcy as the only path back to something resembling peace. Neither response is wrong. Both are well-documented reactions to the same underlying injury. The tragedy is that Isaac and Ellie ended up on opposite ends of that split, each one needing something the other could not give without abandoning their own survival strategy in the process. Ellie eventually partnered with Robert Norton, an EarthGov captain, in an effort to understand what was really driving the marker signal, uncovering evidence that pointed toward Tau Volantis as its true point of origin. Rather than simply reaching out to Isaac herself, she allowed Norton to make that first contact, a choice that speaks to how far the relationship had already drifted by that point. When she finally did send Isaac a message, it told him she was moving on, a phrase vague enough to mean almost anything, and specific enough to end whatever ambiguity Isaac had still been holding on to about where things stood between them. Notice what happens next, because it says something about how unresolved emotional wounds tend to resurface exactly when a person can least afford them to. The moment Isaac is forced back into contact with the marker program, the very thing driving his and Ellie's separation in the first place, he is also forced to confront every unresolved feeling he has been avoiding for 3 years. Grief does not stay contained to whatever compartment a person tries to store it in. It waits, and when circumstances eventually force a return to the source of that grief, it comes back at full strength, often stronger than it was the first time, because it has spent that entire waiting period gathering weight rather than losing it. This dynamic is going to matter a great deal more once this story reaches Tau Volantis, where both Isaac and another character carrying his own unresolved grief will be forced to confront hallucinations built directly out of the people they lost. For now, it is enough to understand that the distance between Isaac and Ellie was never really about a disagreement over strategy. It was about two people who survived the same disaster, developing two incompatible ways of surviving what came after it, and neither one was equipped to bridge that gap while everything around them kept insisting there was no time left to try. The mission pulling Isaac back into contact with all of this did not begin with Ellie or Norton alone. It began with a man determined to burn down the entire system that had spent years hiding the truth about the markers from the public. And understanding him requires looking closely at how an ordinary believer becomes someone capable of unleashing a colony-wide catastrophe just to make a point. Chapter 6. The Believer. Jacob Arthur Danick was a high-ranking member of the Church of Unitology, long before he became the leader of a militant faction calling itself the Circle. Very little is known about his life before that role, though records tie him to Isaac Clarke's own family in an unexpected way. Danick's name appears among the witnesses listed on the will of Marina Clarke, Isaac's mother, connecting him to the Clarke family well before he ever became the man hunting Isaac across a lunar colony. What actually turned a devoted member of an established religion into the architect of a terrorist campaign is a question worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as simple fanaticism. Danick's core grievance was specific. Unitology, at its foundation, taught that the original black marker represented humanity's path toward transcendence, something sacred that had been suppressed by governments unwilling to accept what it meant. When Danick discovered that EarthGov had secretly been experimenting on manufactured red marker copies, running government-controlled tests on something his faith considered holy, he did not experience that discovery as scientific overreach. He experienced it as blasphemy, a direct violation of everything he had built his identity around believing. This kind of escalation follows a pattern researchers have documented extensively in real-world radicalization. A person holding sincere religious or ideological convictions encounters evidence that the institutions around them are secretly violating those convictions, often for their own gain. Rather than producing simple disappointment, that discovery frequently produces a much more volatile reaction, because it does not just challenge a belief, it challenges the believer's sense of what is sacred and what is being desecrated in front of them. And desecration tends to justify responses that ordinary policy disagreements never could. Danick came to see EarthGov's marker test labs not as a scientific program he disagreed with, but as an active violation of something holy, something that demanded to be stopped by any means available, including violence against the very civilians his faith was supposedly meant to save. He built the Circle around exactly that conviction, drawing followers from within the broader Unitologist movement who shared his outrage but had, until Danick gave them a structure and a leader, no organized outlet for it. Consider how quickly a shared grievance can turn into a coordinated force once someone provides the missing pieces: a cause, a leader willing to act, a justification framing violence not as a betrayal of faith, but as the truest expression of it. The Circle's stated goal was to liberate the red markers from EarthGov's test labs, freeing what they believed was sacred technology being held prisoner by a government they considered heretical. In practice, that liberation meant deliberately triggering necromorph outbreaks on colony after colony, using civilian populations as acceptable losses in service of a cause the Circle had convinced itself was worth any cost. This is the part of Danick's story that deserves careful attention, because it separates him from a simple villain acting out of pure malice. Danick does not appear to have believed he was doing evil. Everything about how he framed his campaign, the language of liberation, of restoring something stolen, of undoing a government's blasphemy, suggests a man who saw himself as the last honest defender of a truth everyone else had abandoned. That self-image is precisely what makes radicalized believers so dangerous and so difficult to reason with. A person who knows they are doing wrong can sometimes be persuaded to stop. A person who has convinced themselves they are the only ones still doing right rarely can be, because every act of resistance against them simply confirms, in their own mind, how deep the corruption around them has spread. The attack on New Horizons' lunar colony was Danick's opening move against Isaac directly. and it was designed with a specific cruelty in mind. Rather than simply attempting to capture or kill Isaac quietly, Danik forced him to watch as containment measures around the colony's marker test lab were destroyed, unleashing an outbreak in front of him as a kind of demonstration. This was not incidental violence. It was a message, aimed as much at Isaac's conscience as at his safety, a way of forcing the man unitologists blamed for killing 2 markers to witness exactly what happens when their sacred objects are set free, the way Danik believed they always should have been. What Danik could not have known, standing there forcing Isaac to watch that outbreak unfold, was how closely his own campaign of grief-driven extremism mirrored something happening on a much smaller, much more private scale inside one of the men traveling alongside Isaac. Sergeant John Carver had already lost almost everything the Circle claimed to be fighting for, and the story of exactly how he lost it explains far more about what drives him than any battlefield record ever could. Chapter 7. Uxor. Before any of this reached New Horizons, Dr. Damara Carver was stationed on a colony called Uxor, working as a data archaeologist assigned to study a red marker being held there under EarthGov research protocols. She was married to John Carver, and together they had a young son named Dylan. During her research into the marker's origins, Damara uncovered something that went far beyond routine archaeology. Records connecting the current marker program back to the Sovereign Colonies, evidence of a government cover-up stretching back generations, information dangerous enough that she began quietly enlisting outside help to investigate further, reaching out to Ellie Langford and Robert Norton for support. Picture what it must have felt like for Damara in those final weeks, sitting on information that implicated not just her current employer, but decades of institutional secrecy, stretching back further than anyone had told her to expect. She had a husband trying to hold their family together, and a young son who, according to records recovered afterward, had recently told his mother he wanted to grow up to be a soldier just like his father. Damara bought Dylan a toy soldier for his birthday on John's behalf, a small, ordinary gesture of family life happening in parallel with an investigation that was quietly putting all 3 of them in danger. Carver discovered a sabotage scanner on the colony not long before the end, along with evidence of a long-sight laser triangulated directly on the marker test site where Damara had been working. He tried to warn his wife and son about what he had found. He was too late. A missile struck the site, killing them both in the attack, and in the outbreak that followed. Both Damara and Dylan were transformed into necromorphs. Carver was forced to kill them himself in order to survive. There is no way to soften what that moment does to a person, and this script is not going to attempt to. Being forced to end the lives of your own wife and child, already dead in every way that matters except the physical one, using your own hands, is a form of trauma that clinical literature struggles to even fully categorize, because it combines grief, guilt, and violence into a single, unbearable moment that never fully separates back out again afterward. Carver survived Uxor. What survived with him was something closer to a wound that never got the chance to close, because he was never given time to process what had happened before being pulled directly into the next crisis. What makes Carver's story even harder to sit with is what came before Uxor, evidence suggesting his marriage had already been under significant strain long before any missile struck. Records recovered from his hallucinations and personal logs describe a man who struggled to adjust to family life, who grew irritable and difficult at home, who had been placed on administrative leave at one point after assaulting a superior officer, and who was involved in at least one incident of domestic violence that his own son witnessed. Carver had, by his own account, come dangerously close to taking his own life once before, recording what he believed would be his final words, only for Damara to walk in on him before he could go through with it. He lied to her in that moment, claiming he had simply been thinking, and continued spending more and more time away from home rather than confront what he was struggling with. This detail matters enormously for understanding who Carver becomes later in this story, because it complicates any simple narrative of a grieving husband transformed into a righteous protector by tragedy. Carver's relationship with his family was already fractured by his own struggles with anger, guilt, and a soldier's difficulty translating combat readiness into the softer demands of daily family life, a pattern documented extensively among veterans dealing with untreated post-traumatic stress. He was, by every indication available, already failing as a husband and father in the specific, quiet ways that rarely make it into official records, right up until the moment he was forced to fail them in the most catastrophic way imaginable instead. Grief that follows an already strained relationship behaves differently than grief that follows a peaceful one. Survivors carrying unresolved guilt over how they treated someone before losing them often experience a kind of grief that never fully settles into acceptance, because acceptance would require forgiving themselves for failures that happened while the person they lost was still alive to be failed. Carver did not just lose his family at Uxor. He lost any remaining chance to become the husband and father he had been failing to be. And that specific, compounded loss is going to shape almost every decision he makes for the remainder of this story. He was pulled from the wreckage of Uxor by Robert Norton before the Circle's forces, who had followed him there, could finish what the missile started. What Carver carried away from that colony was not simply grief over losing his family. It was the unresolved wreckage of a man who had already been failing them, now forced to live with that failure permanently, with no possibility left of ever setting it right. That wound would resurface in the harshest way imaginable once the mission reached Tau Volantis, where the planet itself seemed capable of reaching directly into a person's unresolved grief and giving it a voice. For now, 3 broken people, a haunted engineer running from his own past, a soldier carrying guilt he will never be able to repay, and a woman determined to finish what her research had started, are about to be pulled together onto a single ship, heading toward a planet that none of them are prepared for, chasing a source of secrets that has already destroyed one government and is about to start working on the people sent to finish what that government left behind. Chapter 8. The Weight with No Name. Before this story moves forward into the journey toward Tau Volantis, it is worth pausing on something Carver's story reveals that goes beyond an already established idea. This is not simply a case of a man suffering from post-traumatic stress after witnessing violence, though that diagnosis certainly applies to him as well. What Carver carries is closer to something researchers have started calling moral injury, a distinct wound that occurs when a person is forced to act in a way that violates their own deepest sense of who they believe themselves to be. Post-traumatic stress, in its most common form, develops from witnessing or experiencing danger, a threat to survival that leaves the nervous system permanently on alert long after the danger has passed. Moral injury is different. It develops from doing, or failing to prevent, something that shatters a person's own moral identity. A soldier who kills in self-defense during combat may still develop post-traumatic stress from the danger and chaos of that moment. A soldier forced to kill a version of his own transformed child develops something that fear alone cannot fully explain, because the injury is not only to his sense of safety, it is to his sense of himself as a father, a protector, a good man, all 3 identities violated in the same unbearable instant. This distinction matters enormously for understanding why Carver behaves the way he does for the rest of this journey. Fear can be managed with training, with preparation, with the kind of discipline a career soldier spends years developing. Moral injury resists that kind of management entirely, because no amount of tactical competence undoes the fact that a person did something, or failed to do something, that contradicts everything they believed about their own character. Carver had already been struggling with exactly this kind of internal contradiction before Uxor, a soldier proud of his discipline and his commendations, who was, in the quiet corners of his own home, failing at the far harder work of patience and presence a family actually requires. Uxor did not create that contradiction. It detonated it, taking a private, manageable failure and turning it into a public, irreversible catastrophe that could never again be quietly fixed with more effort or better intentions. There is a specific cruelty in how moral injury interacts with grief, one that separates it from ordinary mourning. Ordinary grief allows, eventually, for a kind of peace with memory, a softening of the sharpest edges as time passes. Moral injury resists that softening because every memory of the lost person is filtered through the unbearable fact of what the survivor was forced to do to them, or in Carver's case, forced to do because of what they had already become. He is not simply mourning Damara and Dylan. He is mourning them while simultaneously carrying the unbearable knowledge that his own hands ended what remained of them. An act that no clinical framework fully allows a person to process cleanly, because it was simultaneously an act of mercy and an act that no father should ever have needed to commit. What keeps a person functioning after an injury like this, when functioning at all should be nearly impossible, is often a substitute purpose, something concrete enough to organize the remaining pieces of an identity around. For Carver, that substitute became finishing what Damara had started. Her research, her investigation into the marker cover-up, becomes something he can complete on her behalf, a way of honoring the version of their partnership that existed before everything fell apart, even as the missing piece of his own conscience remains permanently unrepairable. This is a well-documented pattern among survivors of moral injury. Absent any possibility of undoing what happened, many find their only path forward in continuing whatever the lost person's unfinished work was, transforming grief into obligation, because obligation, unlike grief, comes with a clear task attached to it. Keep this in mind as this journey moves forward, because Carver's relationship to the mission ahead is never really about stopping the markers in any abstract sense. It is about a man trying to complete his wife's work as a form of penance he can never actually pay off, chasing a resolution that the planet waiting for him is about to make far more literal and far more dangerous than he could possibly anticipate. Chapter 9. Into the Ice. The journey to Tau Volantis began aboard a ship called the Eudora, carrying Isaac, Carver, Norton, and Ellie toward coordinates that had already destroyed one government's worth of soldiers and scientists 2 centuries earlier, though none of them yet understood the full weight of what they were approaching. Along the way, Ellie continued working through fragments of Damara's research, uncovering pieces of script that appeared to be written in the same language as the markers themselves, further confirmation that whatever waited on that planet was connected to something far older and far larger than a single government's cover-up. Tension traveled with them the entire way. Ellie had wanted to bring Isaac into this fully from the start, but Norton pushed back, worried that Isaac's high-profile connection to the unitologist movement, the man who had, in their eyes, killed 2 sacred markers, would only draw more of the Circle's attention onto a mission already dangerous enough without it. That disagreement between Ellie and Norton was not simply a professional dispute over operational security. It carried an unspoken current of jealousy underneath it as well. A captain who had grown close to Ellie during the time she and Isaac had spent apart, now watching the reappearance of an old relationship complicate something he may have hoped was settled. None of this got resolved cleanly before the ship reached its destination. It simply got buried, the way most unresolved tension gets buried on a vessel, where everyone is trapped together with nowhere else to go and no time left to work anything out properly. Arriving in the system, the crew discovered the wreckage of Sovereign Colonies warships still drifting where they had been left 2 centuries earlier, an entire flotilla's worth of ghosts, along with a distress signal still transmitting weekly from a vessel called the CMS Roanoke. Moving closer to investigate, the Eudora strayed directly into a minefield, the same space mines released generations earlier as part of Scenario 5's effort to seal the planet off permanently from anyone who might try to return. The ship sustained heavy damage in the resulting explosions, and in the chaos that followed, Isaac was forced to retrieve an EVA suit, while Norton and Carver worked frantically to seal off a ruined section of the hull. Before they could finish, the Eudora came apart entirely, hurtling the group out into open space through a debris field that had, until minutes earlier, simply been a silent graveyard nobody living had disturbed in 200 years. There is something worth noting about that minefield beyond its role as a moment of physical danger. It represents Scenario 5 reaching forward across 2 centuries to strike at a new set of people who had no part in the original catastrophe. a literal, mechanical version of the same pattern this story keeps returning to. Danger, once created, rarely stays contained to the moment or the people who created it. It waits, sometimes for generations, for the next group unlucky enough to stumble into range. Separated in the wreckage, each member of the group faced their own version of the same brutal environment, one that stripped away whatever illusions any of them had brought with them about how manageable this mission was going to be. Tau Volantis, even from a distance, was already proving itself far more dangerous than a simple research expedition gone wrong. It was proving itself to be a planet that consumed people the way the ice had once consumed Kaufman, the way the war had once consumed the Sovereign Colonies themselves, patiently and without any particular malice, simply because that was what the environment demanded of anyone who came too close. What none of them yet knew, drifting through the wreckage of a war fought over an energy source none of the original combatants had ever truly understood, was that the answers waiting on the surface below would reframe everything Dr. Serrano's original team had believed about what they were studying. The signal that had drawn 2 governments and now 4 desperate survivors to this frozen world was never what any of them assumed it to be, and the story of what Serrano's original expedition actually found and what it cost them to find it deserves its own careful telling before this journey follows the current crew down onto the ice itself. Chapter 10: Serrano's Grave. 2 centuries earlier, Dr. Earl Serrano had led the Sovereign Colonies' original dig teams into the frozen ground of Tau Volantis, uncovering alien artifacts that confirmed something extraordinary. A civilization had lived here once, long before humanity existed, and that civilization had encountered the same marker technology humanity was now struggling to understand. Among the artifacts recovered was one Serrano's team came to call Rosetta, a discovery that unlocked breakthroughs in translating both the marker's inscriptions and the language of the aliens who had once studied it themselves. What Serrano's team slowly pieced together, aided by data recovered from Rosetta and other specimens, was that the massive energy readings coming from the markers were connected to a device the aliens had built, one large enough to reshape the planet itself, something the humans came to refer to simply as the machine. Understanding how to properly operate that machine required a companion device, a codex, which Serrano's team worked to construct using the neurological and linguistic data they continued to extract from the frozen specimens they kept unearthing. The cost of that progress revealed itself slowly, the way most costs tied to the markers tend to. As the dig continued, personnel connected to the expedition began exhibiting the same symptoms that had haunted every previous encounter with this technology: headaches, difficulty concentrating, hallucinations that grew more vivid and more convincing the longer a person remained near the artifacts. Soldiers who died from these symptoms were not simply buried and left behind. Their bodies were brought aboard the ships for what commanding officers described only as safekeeping, an unsettling decision that suggests someone in command already suspected these deaths were not entirely final in the way ordinary deaths were expected to be. Consider the position Serrano and his research team were actually in during those final weeks. They were uncovering knowledge no human being had ever possessed, technology capable of solving humanity's resource crisis in a single stroke, while simultaneously watching their own colleagues deteriorate around them in ways that mirrored every previous documented encounter with this same artifact family. Isolated research environments create a particular kind of psychological pressure that makes this exact pattern almost predictable. Cut off from outside verification, surrounded only by colleagues experiencing the same symptoms and rationalizing them the same way, a research team gradually loses the outside perspective that might otherwise recognize how far its own judgment has already been compromised. What looks, from any outside vantage point, like an obviously deteriorating and dangerous situation, tends to look from the inside like simply the difficult, demanding cost of doing important work. Serrano's own dig team was ultimately affected in ways that went beyond ordinary marker symptoms, their prolonged proximity to the artifacts and the alien remains warping their behavior into something the surviving records describe only in fragments, never in full. Whatever exactly happened to them individually, the broader expedition around them was already deteriorating on a larger scale by that point, as the same headaches, dementia, and hallucinations that had once haunted a single research station on the moon centuries earlier now spread through an entire flotilla's worth of soldiers and scientists stationed above and below the ice. This is the moment General Mahad's superiors made the decision that would eventually send Kaufman walking alone through a snowstorm, carrying a device nobody outside a small circle of command was ever meant to fully understand. Watching an entire expedition slide toward the same collapse that had once consumed a research station on the moon centuries earlier, the Sovereign Colonies Council made the call to invoke Scenario 5, choosing total erasure over any attempt to salvage what remained of the research. What we believed would save us has only hastened our end, read the order that sealed Tau Volantis for the next 200 years. Everything about the markers, all research, all replicas, even the original black marker itself, was to be buried forever. There is a particular kind of institutional despair contained in that phrasing, one worth sitting with before this story moves forward. An organization that believed it had found salvation, only to watch that same salvation begin consuming the very people sent to retrieve it, arrived at a conclusion that amounted to something close to surrender. Rather than continuing to search for a way to control what they had found, the Sovereign Colonies chose instead to erase all evidence that it had ever existed, accepting the war they were already losing, rather than risk letting this new danger spread any further than it already had. It is a decision that reads, on paper, as caution. In practice, it functioned as concealment, protecting future generations from a truth rather than equipping them to handle it. The same choice EarthGov would go on to make with its own marker test lab program decades later, and the same choice that would eventually put an engineer, a grieving soldier, and a woman still translating her dead friend's research directly back on this same buried ground. Isaac, Carver, and the rest of the surviving crew are about to set foot on exactly the site Scenario 5 was designed to keep sealed forever, walking straight into the wreckage of a decision made 2 centuries before any of them were born. What waits for them beneath that ice is not simply the frozen remains of a failed expedition. It is the truth that expedition died trying to bury, still very much alive, still very much waiting, and about to reach directly into the minds of the very people who have come to finish what Serrano's team never got the chance to. Chapter 11, What the Ice Remembers. Isaac, Carver, and the surviving crew reached the surface of Tau Volantis, scattered rather than together, each of them forced to navigate an unfamiliar and hostile landscape largely alone before slowly regrouping. The conditions Serrano's original team had documented 2 centuries earlier had not softened with time. Snow deep enough to stall vehicles and soldiers alike, wind capable of stripping visibility down to almost nothing, temperatures cold enough that survival itself became a constant, grinding effort layered on top of whatever danger waited in the wreckage around them. What they found scattered across that wreckage told its own story before anyone had to explain it aloud. The remains of the original Sovereign Colonies expedition were still there, frozen research stations, abandoned equipment, and the bodies of soldiers and scientists who had never made it off this planet, preserved in ice the way this world seemed to preserve everything it touched. Among that wreckage, the crew also encountered something Serrano's team had once unearthed themselves, the remains of an alien civilization, a species that had once lived on this planet long before either government's flag had ever been raised anywhere near it. The aliens of Tau Volantis had been an advanced, aquatic species, inhabiting a planet that had once been covered largely in water rather than the frozen wasteland it had since become. At some point in their history, they encountered a marker of their own, and much like every human faction that would eventually follow them, they responded to that encounter with worship rather than caution. They began creating replicas of the artifact in an effort to harness its power, falling increasingly under its influence the same way every subsequent civilization exposed to this technology seems fated to. That worship, combined with the growing influence of the artifacts themselves, eventually triggered what came to be understood as a convergence event. A catastrophic process the aliens themselves had never intended to unleash, and, by the time they recognized what was happening, had very little ability left to stop. Faced with the near-total destruction of their own civilization, a portion of the aliens who had managed to resist the marker's pull made a final, desperate choice. Rather than allow the convergence to complete itself and consume everything, they constructed a massive device, the machine, capable of freezing the entire planet solid, halting the process mid-transformation before it could finish. It worked, in the sense that it stopped total annihilation. It did not fully succeed, in the sense that what it actually froze was not destroyed so much as suspended, held in an unfinished, half-formed state that would go on waiting, patiently, for millions of years for someone to either complete the process the aliens had interrupted, or find a way to end it permanently instead. This detail changes the entire shape of what this story has been building toward. Tau Volantis was never actually the marker homeworld, despite every government that ever sent people here believing exactly that. It was, instead, another victim. A civilization that had already lived through the exact catastrophe humanity kept stumbling toward across 3 centuries of its own history, and had paid an almost unimaginable price simply trying to survive it. The signal every human faction had chased across 2 governments and countless lost lives was never a promise of salvation. It was a warning, left behind by a species that had already learned, the hardest way possible, exactly what this technology was capable of. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that this warning went unheeded for 2 million years, not because nobody ever found it, but because everyone who found it interpreted it as an invitation instead. The Sovereign Colonies saw an energy source. EarthGov saw a program worth quietly continuing. The Unitologists saw a sacred truth being suppressed. None of them, standing at the edge of a warning left behind by a civilization that had already been consumed once, managed to recognize it for what it actually was. This is not simply a failure of intelligence or caution. It reflects something closer to how confirmation bias operates on a civilizational scale, where new evidence tends to get filtered through whatever hope or fear a group already carries into the encounter, rather than being allowed to speak plainly on its own terms. As the crew pushed deeper into the wreckage of both the human and alien expeditions, thawed remains of the original alien inhabitants, transformed by the same necromorph process that had consumed every human colony this technology had ever touched, began to stir once again. Serrano's original biology team had unknowingly thawed some of these specimens out of the ice while attempting to study and communicate with them, believing at the time they were engaging with living alien life forms rather than the infected remains of a civilization long dead. That mistake had cost the original expedition dearly. It was about to threaten this new one exactly the same way, proving that even a 2-million-year-old warning could still find fresh victims the instant anyone stopped treating it as a warning and started treating it as an opportunity instead. Chapter 12. The Machine and the Codex. Completing what the aliens had started 2 million years earlier required more than simply locating their unfinished machine. It required the Codex, a device built to interface with that machine using genetic material specific to the alien species itself, which explained why Serrano's original team had worked so desperately to preserve a specimen they came to call Rosetta, frozen intact and uncorrupted by the necromorph infection that had claimed nearly everything else on the planet. Without pure, uninfected alien DNA, any attempt to properly operate the machine and finish the process the original inhabitants had interrupted was doomed before it began. This is where the story's timelines finally converge into a single, unbroken thread. Kaufman's death 2 centuries earlier, General Mahad's execution of his own soldier and himself immediately afterward, the destruction of Serrano's research under Scenario 5, all of it traced directly back to this single object. Rosetta represented the missing piece both the Sovereign Colonies and, unknowingly, EarthGov after them would need to finally complete what the ancient aliens had left unfinished. The Sovereign Colonies came agonizingly close to using it before their own government chose annihilation of the evidence over completion of the work. What Serrano's original team never got the chance to finish, Isaac and Carver were now, without fully understanding the weight of what they were walking into, being asked to complete in their place. Reconstructing the machine's full purpose required understanding a piece of alien language and technology that had waited, frozen and silent, for 2 million years to be properly interpreted. The codex, once fully assembled using data drawn from Rosetta and the surviving fragments of the aliens' own written history, revealed the true function of the machine the original inhabitants had built. It was never meant to be a permanent solution. It was meant to hold the half-completed convergence in a suspended, frozen state indefinitely, buying time rather than providing an ending. A desperate stopgap built by a civilization that had run out of better options and simply needed the horror to stop long enough for someone, someday, to find a real answer. There is a specific kind of tragedy embedded in that revelation, one worth pausing on before this story moves any further toward its climax. The aliens who built the machine were not the architects of some grand design finally being fulfilled by the humans who arrived after them. They were survivors, doing the only thing available to a species staring down total annihilation, buying time with a device they likely knew, even as they built it, was incomplete. 2 million years is an almost incomprehensible length of time to spend waiting for a solution that never fully arrived, and the humans now standing in the wreckage of that desperate, unfinished gamble were not being handed a gift. They were being handed an obligation nobody had ever actually finished paying off, one that had already consumed 2 prior governments and was now demanding payment from whoever happened to be standing closest when the bill finally came due. Understanding this reframes everything that came before it in this story. The Sovereign Colonies did not fail because they were reckless or foolish. They failed because they were the first humans to stumble into the middle of a 2 million-year-old emergency already in progress, one they had no context for and no way to fully understand in the brief window of time available to them before the same forces that had once nearly consumed an alien civilization began consuming their own people instead. EarthGov did not simply resume a dangerous research program out of pure greed. They resumed an emergency response that had never actually been resolved, one their predecessors had chosen to bury rather than finish, leaving the next generation to inherit both the danger and the responsibility without ever being told the full truth of either. What Isaac and Carver now understood, standing in the ruins of both a human and an alien catastrophe, layered directly on top of each other, was that finishing the machine's original purpose was not a matter of choice anymore. It had never really been a choice for anyone in this story, not for the ancient aliens who built it in desperation, not for Serrano's team who died trying to understand it, not for Kaufman who died carrying knowledge of it 2 centuries earlier. It was simply the next link in a chain that had been passed forward, generation after generation, species after species, each one handling only the small piece placed directly in front of them, none of them ever getting to see, or choose, the full shape of what they were actually part of. Before Isaac and Carver could finish that inherited work, however, the planet itself was about to demand a different kind of payment from both of them, one that had nothing to do with alien technology or ancient history, and everything to do with the grief each man had carried onto this ice with him from the very beginning. Chapter 13. Dementia. As Isaac and Carver pushed deeper into the frozen research sites scattered across Tau Volantis, both men began experiencing something the surviving records from Serrano's original expedition had already documented as a recurring symptom of prolonged marker exposure. Vivid, deeply personal hallucinations, built directly out of whatever loss each man carried closest to the surface of his own mind. For Isaac, this meant confronting a version of Nicole once again, the same hallucination that had haunted him aboard the Ishimura and during the Sprawl outbreak, now returning with renewed intensity as he moved closer to the source of the signal that had first created her presence in his mind. For Carver, it meant something even more devastating. Visions of Demera and Dylan, appearing not as comforting memories, but as hostile, accusing presences, taunting him with the same wound he had never been given the chance to properly grieve. There is a temptation, when watching this kind of hallucination unfold, to treat it as simple horror imagery, monsters wearing the faces of loved ones purely for shock value. That framing misses what is actually happening on a psychological level, and misses it in a way that matters for understanding why this particular symptom hits Carver so much harder than it hits Isaac. Complicated grief, the clinical term for mourning that becomes stuck rather than gradually resolving over time, often manifests through exactly this kind of intrusive, distorted imagery. The mind, unable to fully process a loss, keeps generating versions of the lost person that demand resolution, confrontation, or explanation the survivor was never given the chance to actually receive. What the marker's influence appears to do on Tau Volantis is not create this pattern from nothing. It appears to amplify a psychological vulnerability that was already present, weaponizing unresolved grief that both men were already carrying long before either of them ever set foot on this ice. Notice how differently this plays out for the two of them. Isaac's hallucination of Nicole, however painful, ultimately functions closer to a guide, a presence that has, across multiple encounters with this technology, eventually led him toward difficult truths rather than purely away from them. Carver's version of Damara offers no such guidance. She appears specifically to torment him, informing him that he has nothing left, no wife, no son, no soul, and beckoning him toward death as the only way the three of them could ever be made whole again. This distinction reflects something important about how the two men actually relate to their own losses. Isaac, however imperfectly, has spent 3 years attempting to survive and eventually process what happened to Nicole, even if that process has looked more like avoidance than healing. Carver has done neither. His grief remains exactly where it was the moment he killed his own transformed family, frozen in the same unresolved, punishing state it entered on that day, which means the version of Damara his mind generates carries none of the complexity or guidance Isaac's hallucination offers. It carries only accusation, because accusation is the only language Carver's own unprocessed guilt has ever allowed that grief to speak in. At his lowest point, deep inside one of these episodes, Carver found himself confronted by an imagined landscape built entirely out of his own trauma, birthday presents scattered among jagged stone, photographs of his wife and son arranged like a shrine he had never actually built for them in real life. Facing an artificial version of the very marker that had destroyed his family, Carver managed, on his final attempt, to destroy it, severing the connection between his own mind and whatever influence the real artifact had been exerting over him. It would be comforting to describe that moment as a clean resolution, a man finally overcoming his grief through sheer force of will. The reality documented in the aftermath is more honest and more difficult than that. Carver did not defeat his grief so much as he survived one particularly brutal confrontation with it, buying himself enough stability to keep functioning through what remained of this mission, without ever actually resolving the deeper wound underneath it. This distinction between defeating a psychological wound and simply surviving another encounter with it matters far beyond this one moment in Carver's story. Real grief, particularly grief complicated by guilt and moral injury the way Carver's is, rarely resolves in a single decisive confrontation, however dramatic that confrontation might look from the outside. It tends instead to require a longer, slower process of integration that no single act of willpower can substitute for. What Carver experienced on Tau Volantis bought him time and stability. It did not buy him healing, and the difference between those two outcomes is going to matter a great deal by the time this story reaches its final chapters, when every remaining piece of stability either man has left will be tested against a threat that has already outlasted 2 governments, an entire alien civilization, and now threatens to outlast whatever fragile hope either Isaac or Carver still has left of walking away from this planet whole. Chapter 14. What was lost along the way. Not everyone who set out for Tau Volantis survived long enough to see what waited at the center of it, and the losses that piled up along the way deserved their own accounting rather than being folded quietly into the larger story around them. Robert Norton, the captain who had first brought Isaac back into contact with this mission, did not live to see its end. He was killed during the expedition, and the news of his death landed hardest on the two people who had known him longest: Ellie, who had spent months working alongside him, building the case that eventually pointed toward this planet, and a soldier named Santos, who had crossed paths with the group during the chaos on Tau Volantis and joined their fractured effort to reach Tau Volantis in the first place. Santos took Norton's death badly enough that she began questioning whether the mission itself was still worth continuing. A reaction that makes a great deal of sense once you consider what she and everyone around her had already been through by that point. Carver, still carrying his own barely stabilized grief from the encounter with Damara's hallucination, was the one who pushed back against her doubt, reminding her that hesitation on a planet like this one carried its own cost, and that anyone who became a liability risked being left behind regardless of how understandable their grief was. There is something worth noticing in that exchange. A man who had, only shortly before, been on the losing end of his own psychological collapse was now the one holding a line for someone else's. Survivors of severe trauma sometimes find, once they have weathered their own worst moment, that they become unexpectedly capable of steadying others through a similar crisis, not because the underlying wound has healed, but because having already faced the worst version of it once leaves them with a strange, hard-won familiarity that panic has not yet touched in anyone who has not been through it themselves. Keyhole Station had already cost the group more than Norton alone. Separated from Carver and Norton during the chaos there, Ellie crossed paths with an engineer named Jennifer Santos and a marker operative named Austin Buckle, eventually choosing to press forward toward Tau Volantis without waiting to reunite with the rest of the group. Buckle did not survive what came next, freezing to death during the journey in circumstances that underscored just how thin the margin for error had become on a planet where every single environment, human-made or alien, seemed engineered to punish the smallest mistake. Before departing, Ellie and Robert shared what both of them understood, without saying it outright, might be a final conversation between them, apologizing for the tension that had built up over Isaac, Ellie admitting how frightened she was of what waited ahead. It was the kind of honesty that tends to surface only when two people finally accept how little time might actually be left to say anything at all. Consider for a moment what it does to a small group of survivors to keep losing people incrementally, one death at a time, rather than all at once in a single catastrophic event. A single massive loss can sometimes be processed, however painfully, as one discrete wound. A string of smaller losses spread out across weeks does something different to a group's psychology, wearing away at morale and trust in a slower, more corrosive way, because there is never enough time between each death to properly grieve the last one before the next arrives. By the time the surviving members of this group finally converged on the heart of the Tau Volantis facility, they were not simply exhausted from the physical demands of the environment. They were carrying an accumulated, compounding grief that none of them had been given the chance to properly set down anywhere along the way. This matters for understanding what happens in the story's final stretch, because a group operating under that kind of unprocessed, compounding loss tends to make decisions differently than a group encountering catastrophe for the first time. There is often less hesitation, because hesitation has already proven costly too many times already. There is also, frequently, a kind of grim clarity that sets in once enough has already been lost. A willingness to finish what has been started, specifically because turning back now would mean every death along the way happened for nothing. Whether that clarity represents courage or simply exhaustion past the point of caring is not always an easy distinction to draw from the outside. And it is a distinction Isaac and Carver were about to be forced to make for themselves, standing at the edge of a discovery that would finally explain exactly what all of this loss had actually been in service of. Chapter 15. What the Moon Actually Is. Deep inside the Tau Volantis research facility, piecing together the last remaining fragments of Serrano's decoded alien history, the surviving crew finally uncovered the truth the signal had been pointing toward the entire time. The source of the marker energy, the object every government and every faith had spent centuries chasing, was never buried somewhere beneath the planet's surface waiting to be excavated. It was in orbit above them, And it was not an artifact in any sense anyone had previously understood the term. It was, and remains, a brethren moon, the true end state of what the necromorph infection ultimately becomes if a convergence event is ever allowed to fully complete itself. Understanding what a brethren moon actually is requires setting aside every previous assumption this story has carried forward about the nature of the threat. Markers, in every earlier chapter of this saga, functioned as objects, artifacts capable of triggering outbreaks and manipulating minds, dangerous but ultimately finite, something that could theoretically be destroyed or contained. A brethren moon represents something categorically different. It is what happens when a convergence event is allowed to run its full course. An entire planet's worth of biomass fused together into a single, moon-sized entity, no longer merely producing the marker signal, but functioning as its true source, communicating with every marker replica across the galaxy, the way a single voice might communicate through countless separate speakers. The brethren moon orbiting Tau Volantis had never actually completed that transformation, which is the only reason any of this story was still possible to survive at all. The alien inhabitants' desperate gamble with the machine, freezing their planet solid 2 million years earlier, had interrupted the convergence event mid-formation, leaving the resulting moon locked in a permanently half-finished state. Even incomplete, even frozen mid-transformation for 2 million years, that half-formed moon had still been powerful enough to keep broadcasting its signal outward across the stars, calling to every marker replica still active anywhere in human space, patiently waiting for someone, someday, to either complete the process it had been interrupted in the middle of, or finally put an end to it for good. This revelation reframes the entire scope of what this story has actually been about from the very beginning. It was never simply the story of one alien artifact causing isolated outbreaks across scattered human colonies. It is the story of a single, ancient, unfinished catastrophe, reaching across 2 million years and an entire galaxy, using every subsequent civilization it touched as an unwitting extension of its own incomplete transformation. The Sovereign Colonies did not stumble onto some isolated threat when they found Tau Volantis. They stumbled onto the very source of everything humanity had been fighting since the moment Michael Altman first pulled a strange object out of the ocean floor centuries earlier, an ending point the entire franchise had been building toward, without any of its human characters ever fully understanding the shape of what they were actually part of. There is a specific kind of horror embedded in learning that the danger you have spent your entire life fighting was never actually the true threat, only a fragment of something far larger and far older than you had any way of perceiving. It forces a recalibration of everything that came before it, every sacrifice, every loss, every difficult choice made along the way. None of it wasted exactly, but all of it suddenly revealed as smaller in scope than it felt in the moment it was happening. Isaac had spent years believing he was fighting a series of isolated disasters, each one horrific but ultimately contained. What he was actually fighting, without ever fully knowing it, was a single ongoing catastrophe stretching back millions of years before he was born, one that had already consumed an entire alien civilization, and was patiently, methodically working its way through humanity's own history, one colony, one outbreak, one grieving survivor at a time. Danik, still pursuing the group with the remnants of his forces, understood none of this the way Isaac and Carver were now beginning to. To Danik and the Circle, this moon still represented the promise their faith had always taught them to expect, the final evolution their prophet Michael Altman had supposedly died trying to bring about. What Isaac and Carver now understood, standing at the edge of the very thing Danik had spent his entire campaign trying to unleash, was that completing this moon's transformation would not deliver the ascension Danik and his followers believed in. It would deliver something closer to what the aliens themselves had died trying to prevent, a fully realized convergence event capable of consuming not just one colony or one planet, but potentially reaching outward across every world the marker network's signal had ever touched. Stopping that outcome required finishing what the aliens had started with their machine. Not completing the convergence, but permanently ending the moon's half-formed existence before it could finish transforming and call the rest of its kind fully awake. What none of them yet understood, standing at the edge of that final confrontation, was that the very act of engaging with the moon at all, even in an attempt to destroy it, was about to prove far more costly and far less final than any of them were prepared for. Chapter 16: The Machine's Price. The final confrontation on Tau Volantis unfolded across a landscape that felt less like a battlefield and more like the inside of something alive. Isaac and Carver forced to fight their way toward the reconfigured machine, while the Brethren moon itself, even in its incomplete state, actively resisted every attempt to reach it. Jacob Danik, still convinced this moon represented the ascension his faith had promised him, made his own final push toward the site, determined to see his version of convergence completed rather than stopped, right up until the moment his own campaign finally caught up with him in the middle of the chaos he had spent the entire story creating. Reaching the machine required more than simply arriving at its location. Isaac and Carver had to physically reconfigure the device using the same principles the ancient aliens had originally built it around, working against a countdown neither of them fully controlled as the half-formed moon continued straining toward its own completion around them. This is the moment where every earlier thread of this story finally converges into a single, unbearable choice. Two men, each carrying grief the planet itself had spent the entire mission weaponizing against them, now had to work together with total precision in the middle of the most dangerous environment either of them had ever encountered, to finish a task an ancient civilization had died attempting, and two subsequent human governments had either failed to complete or deliberately chosen to bury rather than finish. They succeeded, in the narrow, immediate sense that matters most in a moment like this one. Isaac and Carver managed to reconfigure the machine and properly kill the Tau Volantis moon, ending its half-formed existence and silencing, at least locally, the signal it had been broadcasting for 2 million years. For a brief moment, whatever moment of triumph a story like this one allows itself, it would have been reasonable for either man to believe they had actually finished something, closed a loop that had been open since long before either of them was born. That victory did not hold the way either of them needed it to, even incomplete. Even in the final moments of its destruction, the moon had absorbed enough biomass and enough proximity to the human forces fighting it to accomplish one last devastating thing before it died. It managed to make contact with the rest of its kind, Brethren moons scattered across human-occupied space that had, until this moment, remained dormant and disconnected from whatever had been happening on this one isolated, frozen planet. The signal Isaac and Carver believed they had just silenced was not, in fact, silenced at all. It had simply been transmitted outward one final time, an act of communication rather than destruction, waking every other Brethren moon across human-occupied space in the same instant this one finally died. There is a particular cruelty in that outcome, worth sitting with before this story moves toward its final chapters. Isaac and Carver did not fail on Tau Volantis. They accomplished exactly what they set out to do, destroying the specific threat directly in front of them through genuine sacrifice and genuine cost. What they could not have known, and arguably could not have prevented even if they had known, was that succeeding against this one moon was never actually going to be enough, because the true scale of the danger had always existed far beyond the boundaries of the single planet they had been sent to save. This is the same trap that has repeated across every previous chapter of this story in a smaller form. The Sovereign Colonies believed erasing the evidence would end the danger. EarthGov believed secrecy would contain it. Danik believed convergence would deliver salvation. Each of them, working with only the fragment of the truth directly available to them, made a choice that felt complete and final, within the narrow scope of what they could actually see, only for that choice to reveal itself as insufficient the moment the true scale of the threat finally came into view. Isaac and Carver's victory on Tau Volantis follows that exact same shape, and it does so with a devastating irony neither man could have anticipated walking in. The very act of finally correctly finishing what the ancient aliens started, ending the local threat the right way for the first time in this story's entire history, is what triggered the far larger catastrophe underneath it. Sometimes doing the right thing at the smaller scale is precisely what exposes the true size of the problem waiting underneath it, a lesson this story has been building toward since the crew of the Terra Nova encountered what was buried on that frozen planet 200 years earlier, and one it was about to deliver with far more finality than either Isaac or Carver were prepared to survive. Chapter 17. After the credits. The immediate aftermath of the machine's activation left both Isaac and Carver in a state closer to wreckage than victory. Whatever specific injuries either man sustained in those final moments against the moon, both were left severely weakened, and the environment around them offered no gentler landing than anything else this planet had provided across the entire mission. What survives in the record of that final sequence is fragmentary rather than complete, ending with both men still on Tau Volantis as the dust from the moon's destruction continued to settle around them. Ellie, who had made her own separate journey toward this same objective across the length of this mission, was not present for that final confrontation, and the emotional weight of what she experienced in its aftermath comes through clearly even in the limited record available. As the chaos on Tau Volantis reached its conclusion, Ellie's voice can be heard calling out for Isaac, uncertain in that moment whether he had actually survived what she knew he had just walked into. There is something worth pausing on in that detail. A woman who had spent the better part of 2 years pulling away from Isaac, protecting herself from exactly this kind of loss by maintaining distance, finding in this final moment that the distance had done nothing to actually protect her from how much his survival still mattered to her. What makes this ending particularly difficult to sit with is how little resolution it actually offers, even for viewers who have followed this entire story from its very first chapter. Isaac's own voice can be heard responding, calling Ellie's name in return, confirmation that he had, at minimum, survived long enough to answer her. Beyond that single exchange, the story offers no further clarity about what state either Isaac or Carver was actually in, whether their injuries were survivable in any lasting sense, or what exactly came next for either of them in the immediate hours following the moon's destruction. This kind of deliberately incomplete ending tends to frustrate audiences accustomed to stories that tie every thread together before the credits roll, and it is worth taking that frustration seriously rather than dismissing it. Stories that withhold resolution are not always doing so for artistic effect. Sometimes incomplete endings reflect something closer to honesty about how real catastrophe actually works, refusing the audience the comfort of a clean conclusion precisely because the underlying threat this story has been tracking was never actually resolved in any clean way either. Every previous chapter of this saga has demonstrated the same pattern. A crisis appears to end, only for the ending to reveal itself, sometimes years or decades later, as merely the closing of one small chapter inside a far larger, ongoing catastrophe that was never actually finished. There is also something worth noting in how this particular installment chooses to encode its own uncertainty. In this installment, the first letters of each chapter title have spelled out a hidden message, a pattern that had appeared in earlier entries in this same story. In this installment, that hidden message reads, "Brother Moons are awake," a warning embedded directly into the structure of the story itself, confirming for anyone paying close enough attention that whatever victory Isaac and Carver achieved against the single moon above Tau Volantis was never actually the ending it appeared to be on the surface. The threat this entire saga has been building toward was never contained to one planet, one signal, or one government's worth of secrecy. It had always been larger than that, and the story's own structure was quietly telling its audience so, even in the moment that looked, on the surface, most like triumph. Whatever peace either Isaac, Carver, or Ellie found in the immediate aftermath of Tau Volantis, it would prove to be exactly as temporary as every previous moment of relief this story has offered across its entire history. The moon they destroyed had, in its final act, ensured that the danger this story began with 200 years earlier was no longer confined to a single frozen planet at all. It had gone galaxy-wide, and the full weight of what that awakening actually meant was about to arrive far sooner and far more violently than anyone still standing on that ice had any reason to expect. Chapter 18. RIP. What happened to Isaac and Carver in the immediate aftermath of the moon's destruction eventually became clearer through a separate, later chapter of this same story, one that picks up exactly where the ambiguity of Tau Volantis left off. Both men survived the fall that seemed in the moment almost certain to kill them, waking on the planet's surface disoriented and struggling to process how they had lived through something that should not have been survivable. This continuation carries its own hidden structure as well, its chapter titles spelling out a single, blunt message once assembled together: make us whole. A grim acknowledgement, embedded directly into the story's own architecture, of exactly how little genuine relief this continuation was actually offering its audience. Isaac's condition in the aftermath proved to be the more immediately alarming of the two. Having sustained severe injuries during the fight against the moon, he found himself slipping closer to a complete loss of sanity than at any previous point across this entire saga, his grip on reality deteriorating in ways that went beyond even his previous encounters with marker-influenced hallucination. What eventually pulled him back from that edge was a realization about what was actually happening to him, an understanding that the Brethren moons themselves, now fully awake across human-occupied space, appeared to be deliberately working to slow both him and Carver down, using every psychological tool available to them to keep the two men from reaching safety in time. This detail matters for understanding just how much the nature of the threat had escalated since the confrontation on Tau Volantis. Earlier in this story, marker influence functioned largely as a byproduct of proximity, an unintended side effect of standing too close to something dangerous. What Isaac now confronted was closer to deliberate, targeted interference, an intelligence on the other end of that signal actively working against him and Carver specifically, treating the two men less as incidental casualties and more as genuine threats worth actively delaying. Some of the Circle's surviving members, traveling with the group during this stretch, began experiencing their own crisis of faith as a result of everything they had witnessed on Tau Volantis. Several attempting to desert a cause that had, for the first time in this story, started to look less like salvation and more like exactly the horror it had always actually been. Carver, for his part, remained largely stable through this stretch, a notable shift from the man who had nearly lost himself entirely to grief only a short time earlier. Watching Isaac's own grip on reality slip, Carver found himself in the position of steadying someone else through the exact kind of psychological collapse he had barely survived himself, an echo of the same dynamic that had played out earlier with Santos after Norton's death. Trauma, once survived, does not simply disappear from a person's life afterward. It often becomes, strangely and imperfectly, a resource, a form of hard-won familiarity that allows a survivor to recognize and steady the same collapse in someone else, even while their own underlying wounds remain entirely unresolved. Their journey eventually brought them back toward Earth itself, racing against a threat that had by this point expanded well beyond anything either man could realistically hope to stop, through the kind of localized, sacrificial heroism that had worked, however costly, on Tau Volantis. What awaited them at the end of that journey confirmed everything the hidden message in this story's earlier chapters had already warned its audience to expect. Chapter 19. The Shape of Three Disasters. Stepping back now, with the full weight of this story finally visible from beginning to end, it becomes possible to see something that was much harder to notice while living inside any single chapter of it. Three separate disasters, spread across three different ships and three different casts of survivors, are not actually three different stories wearing the same title. They are the same underlying failure, repeating itself with just enough variation each time to feel unfamiliar in the moment, right up until you lay all three side by side and watch the pattern finally reveal itself in full. The first disaster took place aboard a mining vessel, and its horror was, in a strange way, the most straightforward of the three. A crew was sent to retrieve an object nobody in command fully understood, working under a corporation more concerned with profit than with the warnings a government scientist had already tried to raise about that same object decades earlier. What made the Ishimura's catastrophe so brutal was its intimacy. A single ship, a single crew, and one engineer chasing the woman he loved through corridors that kept lying to him about whether she was still alive to be found. The corporation's greed and the government's cover-up were real, but they operated mostly in the background of that particular story, felt more through consequence than through direct confrontation. Isaac spent that first disaster fighting an enemy that felt, for most of the runtime, almost personal, a nightmare built specifically around his own grief rather than a system's negligence. The second disaster changed the shape of that intimacy into something far more violating. Rather than simply losing someone he loved to an outside threat, Isaac himself became the site of the danger. A government program calling itself Project Convergence had used his own mind, without his consent and without his memory of any of it, to grow a new marker directly out of whatever the first catastrophe had left imprinted inside him. He woke up on Titan Station having lost 2 years of his own life to captivity and experimentation, hunted not by an external monster, but by an institution that viewed his continued existence as a resource to be harvested, rather than a person to be protected. The final confrontation of that story took place, tellingly inside Isaac's own mind, a battle against a hallucination of Nicole that could only be won by accepting she was gone, and then physically fighting his way free of a version of himself the marker had been quietly cultivating the entire time. Notice what happened to the location of the threat across those first 2 chapters of this saga. In the first disaster, the danger came from outside, an artifact and a corpse that would not stay dead. In the second, the danger had moved inside, planted directly into Isaac's own body and mind by an institution that had decided his trauma was simply raw material for a research program. That progression tells you something important about how these kinds of systems actually escalate over time. The first time an institution encounters something dangerous, it tends to respond with concealment, hiding the threat from public view while trying to control it from a careful distance. The second time, having already learned that concealment alone was not enough to contain the danger, the same kind of institution frequently escalates toward direct exploitation, deciding that if the threat cannot simply be hidden, perhaps it can instead be harnessed, weaponized, turned into an asset rather than a liability. EarthGov did not repeat the Sovereign Colonies' mistake by accident. It repeated a slightly worse version of that same mistake, because concealment alone had already failed once, and somebody, somewhere in a position of power, decided the next logical step was control rather than caution. The third disaster, the one this entire video has spent its runtime walking through, represents the final and most complete version of that same escalation. By this point, the danger was no longer confined to a single ship or a single station. It had expanded outward to the scale of an entire planet, an entire alien civilization's failed containment effort, and eventually an entire galaxy's worth of dormant threats waking up in response to what should have been a contained local victory. Isaac was no longer fighting to save one woman, and he was no longer fighting an institution that had turned his own body into a weapon. He was fighting the actual source of everything both previous disasters had only ever been symptoms of, a discovery that reframed his entire personal history as a small, repeating fragment of something almost incomprehensibly larger than himself. There is a specific kind of dread built into watching a threat grow this way across a trilogy, and it is worth naming directly, rather than simply letting it sit in the background. Each installment of this story ends with what looks, in the moment, like genuine victory. Isaac destroys the first marker and escapes the Ishimura. He destroys the second marker and escapes Titan Station. He and Carver destroy the Tau Volantis moon, and, for a brief moment, believe they have finally ended this cycle for good. Each of those victories is real, in the narrow sense that the immediate threat directly in front of the characters is genuinely defeated. None of those victories actually resolves the larger pattern underneath them, because the pattern was never really about any single marker, any single station, or any single moon. It was about a species that kept encountering something it did not understand, responding to that encounter with either worship or weaponization rather than caution, and then discovering, too late, that the true scale of what it had been playing with was always several sizes larger than anyone involved had allowed themselves to believe. This is also where the emotional arc of these three stories tracks something worth naming plainly. The first disaster is a story about personal grief being exploited by a system Isaac barely understands is even operating around him. The second is a story about that same system turning its full attention directly onto him, using his own trauma as raw material. The third is a story about Isaac finally understanding the full shape of the system that has been using him this entire time, only to discover that understanding it does not actually grant him the power to stop it. Insight, in this story, never functions as victory the way it often does in simpler narratives. Isaac ends this trilogy knowing more than he has ever known about what he has actually been fighting. And that knowledge changes almost nothing about the outcome waiting for him and everyone he loves above Earth. There is a real-world parallel worth drawing here, one that has nothing to do with alien artifacts, and everything to do with how institutions handle emerging danger they do not yet fully understand. Historical analysis of organizational disasters, from industrial accidents to public health failures, consistently finds a similar escalating pattern across repeated encounters with the same underlying risk. Initial exposure produces concealment, an instinct to manage the danger quietly rather than admit its full scope. Repeated exposure, once concealment alone proves insufficient, frequently produces a shift toward attempted control, an effort to harness or contain what could not simply be hidden. Only after both of those strategies have already failed, often at devastating human cost, does a third pattern sometimes emerge, a genuine reckoning with the true scale of the problem. This story never actually reaches that third stage. Isaac, Carver, and everyone around them ran out of time before any real reckoning could happen, and that failure to reach a genuine reckoning before the cost became unbearable is, more than any single marker or any single moon, the actual disaster this trilogy has been depicting the entire time. What separates this third installment from the two that came before it, then, is not simply a larger scale of threat or a bigger cast of survivors. It is the moment this story finally stops being about surviving one disaster and starts being about understanding why disasters like this one keep happening in the first place. Generation after generation, government after government, each one convinced its own version of concealment or control would finally be the one that worked. None of them were. And by the time this trilogy's final chapter arrives, neither Isaac nor anyone watching alongside him has any illusions left about whether the next one will be either. Chapter 20: Ordinary Hands. There is a question this story never asks directly, but it sits underneath nearly every chapter of it once you start looking for it. Who actually carries out the violence in a story like this one? Not the markers themselves, which function more like a force of nature than a conscious villain making individual choices. The actual physical harm across this entire saga, the executions, the cover-ups, the colonies sacrificed for research data, all of it was carried out by ordinary people following orders that came from somewhere above them. People who, in almost every case, could have refused and chose not to. Consider General Mahad, standing on an ice field 200 years before Isaac Clarke was born, executing a soldier who had just completed an impossible mission, and then turning the weapon on himself immediately afterward. Mahad was not, by any indication in the historical record, a sadist who enjoyed killing his own men. He was a career officer who had, over the length of an entire war, become someone capable of carrying out an execution the instant his superiors decided it was necessary, without visible hesitation, without any recorded protest beyond simply completing the task assigned to him. The same pattern repeats with the security forces on Titan Station, who followed Tiedemann's orders to eliminate key research subjects rather than evacuate them, with the soldiers who carried out Scenario 5's purges across an entire flotilla, and with the countless unitologist followers who carried out Danek's campaign of colony-wide outbreaks, believing, sincerely, that they were liberating something sacred, rather than committing mass murder. This is where a specific and uncomfortable piece of real-world psychology becomes essential to understanding what this story is actually depicting underneath its surface horror. In the 1960s, a set of controversial psychological experiments studied how far ordinary people would go in administering what they believed were increasingly painful and dangerous shocks to another person, simply because an authority figure in the room instructed them to continue. The results, replicated in various forms many times since, remain deeply unsettling. A majority of ordinary participants, people with no history of cruelty, no diagnosable disorder, and no particular hatred toward the person they believed they were harming, continued administering what they thought were dangerous, potentially lethal shocks simply because someone in a position of authority calmly told them the experiment required it. What that research revealed was not that most people are secretly monsters waiting for permission. It revealed something arguably more disturbing. Most people, placed inside a structure that removes personal responsibility and replaces it with clear, authoritative instruction, will do almost anything, provided the instruction comes from someone they have already agreed to treat as legitimate. That finding maps almost perfectly onto every act of institutional violence this trilogy depicts. Mahad did not personally decide that Vandal needed to die. He was told, by a chain of command he had spent his entire career agreeing to follow, that this was necessary, and he carried it out the way a soldier carries out any other order, treating the moral weight of the act as something that belonged to the institution issuing it, rather than to the hand actually pulling the trigger. Tiedemann's security forces did not personally weigh the ethics of sacrificing Isaac, Strauss, and Lexine Weller for the sake of ongoing marker research. They received orders from a director who had already convinced himself, through years of institutional reasoning, that the research was worth any cost, and they carried those orders out the way employees anywhere carry out instructions from a superior they have already decided to trust. What makes Danek's followers a slightly different case, and worth examining separately, is that their obedience was not primarily structural in the way a soldier's chain of command is structural. It was ideological, rooted in a genuine belief system rather than simple institutional hierarchy. And yet the underlying mechanism produces a remarkably similar result. A person convinced that a cause is sacred enough will often carry out violence in service of that cause with the same fluency and the same absence of personal doubt that a soldier displays following a direct order, because in both cases the individual has already outsourced the moral weight of the act to something larger than themselves, whether that something is a chain of command or a system of belief. The philosopher who first popularized the phrase describing this phenomenon as a kind of banality rather than a monstrous exception was writing about a specific historical atrocity, but the underlying observation travels well beyond that single context. Evil carried out at scale rarely requires monsters. It requires ordinary people willing to let someone or something else make the moral decision on their behalf, and then simply executing whatever that decision turns out to be. This reframes something important about how to actually watch this story, rather than simply follow its plot. The true horror of this trilogy was never really located in the necromorphs themselves, however viscerally frightening those creatures are made to appear on screen. The necromorphs are, in a sense, the least morally complicated part of this entire saga. A force of nature responding to stimulus without conscience, because it has no conscience to begin with. The genuinely disturbing violence in this story, the kind that should actually stay with a viewer long after the monsters themselves have faded from memory, is the violence carried out by people who absolutely did have a conscience, and who used the structure of the institutions and belief systems around them to quiet that conscience just enough to keep functioning anyway. Carver's own arc actually complicates this pattern in an important way worth returning to here. Unlike Mahad or Tiedemann's security forces, Carver's worst act was not something he carried out in obedience to any external authority. It was something forced on him by circumstance, ending the lives of a wife and son who had already, in the most literal sense, stopped being the people he loved. That distinction matters enormously, because it means Carver's story does not actually fit neatly into this pattern of institutional obedience the way almost every other act of violence in this saga does. He was not following orders. He was making an impossible choice alone, without the psychological cover that obedience to authority typically provides. This may be part of why his grief proved so much harder to metabolize than the guilt carried by soldiers who could, at least partially, tell themselves they were simply doing what they were told. Obedience offers a kind of psychological shelter, however morally hollow that shelter actually is. A person who can say they were only following orders retains a sliver of distance from the act itself. Carver had no such distance available to him. What he did with his own judgment fully intact, and that fact alone may explain why his wound never closed the way it eventually did for so many of the soldiers and followers who carried out this story's other atrocities without ever fully reckoning with what they had actually done. There is a final piece of this pattern worth naming before moving on, because it reaches beyond the individual soldiers and followers and back toward the institutions issuing their orders in the first place. Every layer of command across this entire saga, from the Sovereign Colonies Council to EarthGov's leadership to Danik at the head of the Circle, relied on the same basic mechanism to function. Each one needed a supply of ordinary people willing to carry out extraordinary harm without asking too many questions about where the instructions were ultimately coming from or why. Remove that supply of willing hands, and every atrocity in this story becomes logistically impossible to carry out, regardless of how badly any single leader might have wanted it done. Mahad alone could not have executed an entire flotilla's worth of personnel. Danik alone could not have unleashed outbreaks across multiple colonies. These catastrophes required thousands of ordinary hands willing to do the actual work, and the uncomfortable truth this story keeps circling back to, chapter after chapter, is that those hands were never in short supply. They rarely are. That, more than any single artifact or any single moon, may be the most disturbing discovery buried inside this entire saga. The technology driving this story is fictional. The willingness of ordinary people to carry out terrible acts on behalf of an authority or a belief system they have already decided to trust is not fictional at all. It is the single most reliable resource every institution across this entire trilogy was able to count on, and it never once let any of them down. Chapter 21. What's Left. Isaac and Carver's ship finally reached Earth to find it already under direct assault, the Brethren moons that had awakened in the wake of Tau Volantis having arrived well ahead of them. Already tearing into the planet, both men had spent this entire journey desperately trying to protect. Picture what that arrival must have actually looked like from the inside of that cockpit, a world neither of them had seen in years, the place every earlier sacrifice in this story was supposedly made to protect, visible through the viewport not as a safe harbor waiting to receive them, but as a battlefield already lost before they had even entered its orbit. Before either man could attempt any further response to what they were seeing, one of the moons struck their vessel directly, and the story ends there, offered to its audience without any further resolution about what became of either character afterward. There is no way to soften what that ending actually represents within the broader shape of this saga, and it is worth resisting the urge to soften it here either. Everything this story traced across 3 full installments, a religion built on a lie, a corporation, and 2 governments that chose secrecy over honesty at every possible turn. Individual survivors who lost everything trying to stop a threat none of them ever fully understood the scale of. All of it arrives at an ending that offers no victory large enough to match the cost required to reach it. Earth stands unprotected. Humanity's fate remains, at best, unresolved, and at worst, already decided in a direction nobody watching would want to accept. Whatever the 2 men who fought hardest against this threat across the length of this entire story actually experienced in that final moment, the story chooses not to show it, leaving its audience with an ending defined more by absence than by any clear resolution at all. It is worth asking at this point what a story like this one is actually trying to communicate by refusing its audience the comfort of a clean ending. Every previous chapter of this saga has traced the same underlying pattern in smaller form, institutions choosing concealment over honesty, individuals inheriting catastrophes they never created and were never fully equipped to understand. Victories that, on closer inspection, always turn out to be smaller and more temporary than they appeared in the moment they were won. This final, unresolved ending is not a departure from that pattern. It is the pattern's fullest, most complete expression, refusing even the audience itself the false comfort of believing this particular catastrophe was ever actually contained within the scope this story initially presented it as having. Consider what Isaac Clarke's entire arc actually looks like once you trace it from beginning to end, rather than watching it unfold one disaster at a time. A ship engineer who once had nothing more complicated on his mind than a woman he loved and a job he was good at, found himself, over the course of a few short years, transformed into something closer to a witness, standing at the center of humanity's entire unresolved relationship with a danger it never chose to understand properly. He did not ask for any of this. He was not selected because of some unique heroism or unusual courage. He simply happened to be close enough at each critical juncture that the weight of the story kept landing on him rather than on someone else. That randomness matters. It would be more comfortable, in a sense, to believe Isaac was chosen for some larger purpose, that his suffering across 3 separate catastrophes served some grand design finally being fulfilled. Nothing in the actual record supports that comfort. Isaac was simply present, again and again, at the exact moment institutions and belief systems far larger than himself finally collided with consequences they had spent generations trying to avoid. That distinction between being chosen and simply being present is worth dwelling on, because it changes how this entire story reads once you accept it fully. Stories built around a chosen figure carry a kind of hidden reassurance inside them, a suggestion that the universe has some structure to it, that suffering gets distributed according to some logic a person could theoretically understand and prepare for. Stories built around a person who was simply standing in the wrong place offer no such reassurance. They suggest instead that catastrophe distributes itself according to proximity rather than merit, landing on whoever happens to be closest rather than whoever happens to deserve it or be equipped to handle it. Every single character in this saga who suffered most severely fits that second pattern rather than the first. Buckell died because he was the soldier available when a device needed retrieving. Damara Carver died because her research took her close enough to a truth someone wanted buried. Santos, Buckle, Norton, and countless colonists across multiple worlds died because a signal reached the place they happened to be living and working when it finally came due. None of them were chosen. All of them were simply close. There is a real-world concept worth bringing in here, one that describes something families and communities experience long after the individuals in this story would recognize as fiction. Intergenerational trauma refers to the way harm experienced by one generation does not stay contained to that generation, passing instead into the nervous systems, behaviors, and unresolved patterns of the generations that follow, often without those descendants ever fully understanding where the weight they are carrying actually originated. A grandchild raised by a parent who was never allowed to properly grieve an earlier catastrophe often inherits a version of that unprocessed grief secondhand, expressed through anxiety, distance, or fear that has no obvious source in their own direct experience. This story has been depicting almost exactly that pattern, only stretched across institutions and centuries, rather than families and decades. The Sovereign Colonies' unprocessed catastrophe on Tau Volantis did not simply end when their government collapsed. It passed forward into EarthGov, which absorbed the unresolved danger without ever being given the full truth of what it actually was. And EarthGov's own mishandling of that inheritance eventually passed the same unresolved weight forward again, onto Isaac, onto Carver, onto every survivor still standing at the end of this saga's final chapter. What makes this pattern so difficult to interrupt, whether in a family or in a civilization, is that each generation receiving the inheritance genuinely believes it is handling the problem better than the generation before it. The Sovereign Colonies believed erasure was a responsible solution. EarthGov believed secrecy and controlled research were more responsible than either erasure or full disclosure. Isaac and Carver believed that finishing the ancient aliens' unfinished machine, doing the work properly for the first time in this story's entire history, would finally be the responsible ending the two previous governments had failed to provide. Each generation, in other words, believed itself to be the one that would finally break the cycle, and each one, in its own way, simply added another layer onto a catastrophe that had never actually been interrupted at its root, only ever slowed down, delayed, or redirected onto whoever came next. The ancient aliens deserve a place in this accounting too, because they represent the earliest documented link in that same chain, and their version of the pattern is arguably the most tragic of all. 2 million years before any human being existed, a species advanced enough to build a planet-freezing machine encountered exactly the same artifact humanity would eventually encounter, responded to it with exactly the same worship and exactly the same attempt at harnessing its power, and paid for that response with the near-total loss of their own civilization. What they left behind was not a solution. It was a delay, an unfinished stopgap built by survivors who had run out of every other option and simply needed the horror to stop long enough for someone, someday, to find a real answer. 2 million years passed. The answer never arrived. What arrived instead was another species making the exact same mistakes in the exact same order, close enough to the original catastrophe to inherit its unfinished emergency without ever inheriting the warning that should have come attached to it. Sit with the scale of that failure for a moment, because it reframes everything Isaac and Carver were actually attempting on Tau Volantis. Two exhausted, injured men, working with fragmentary translations and borrowed alien technology, were trying to finish a job an entire advanced civilization had failed to complete, with all of its resources, all of its knowledge, and all of the time it had before the convergence overtook it. That they got as far as they did is genuinely remarkable. That it was not enough was arguably decided 2 million years before either of them was born. In the moment, a species chose delay over resolution, because delay was the only option still available to it. This is why the ambiguity of this ending carries so much more weight than a simple cliffhanger designed to sell a sequel. A clean, decisive ending, whether triumphant or tragic, would have suggested that this particular chain finally reached its conclusion, for better or worse. What this story offers instead is something closer to a pause mid-transmission. The signal cutting out before anyone watching can determine whether what comes next is survival or extinction. That kind of uncertainty mirrors something genuinely true about how large-scale institutional failures tend to resolve in the real world as well. Rarely do they end with a single, decisive moment that everyone can point to afterward as the conclusion. More often, they trail off into partial recoveries, incomplete reckonings, and consequences that continue playing out for decades after the event itself has faded from public attention, leaving the people who lived through it with exactly the kind of unresolved, permanently open wound this story chooses to end on. There is also a harder, less comfortable reading of this ending worth naming before moving on, one that concerns the audience rather than the characters. Part of what makes an unresolved ending frustrating is that it denies the viewer something stories typically provide, as a matter of course, a sense that the time invested in following these people has purchased some kind of closure in return. Notice, though, how closely that frustration mirrors what nearly every character in this saga experienced firsthand. Isaac never got closure on Nicole in any form that actually settled. Carver never got closure on Damara and Dylan, only a temporary stabilization that let him keep functioning. Ellie never got closure on Norton, on Buckle, or on the relationship with Isaac that kept ending and restarting across multiple catastrophes. Denying the audience closure is, in that light, less a failure of storytelling than the story extending its central experience outward past the screen, insisting that anyone who followed these people this far should have to feel at least a fraction of what following this thread actually costs the people living inside it. Think back for a moment to where this entire trilogy actually began. A geophysicist who never wanted to start a religion pulling a strange object out of the ocean floor because his curiosity outpaced his caution. A dead man's silence used to build a faith he never consented to, a corporation that decided a lie was more profitable than a warning. Every single choice in that opening chapter belonged to someone who believed, in the moment, that they were making a small, contained decision, unaware that they were actually setting in motion a chain that would still be actively killing people 3 centuries later on a ship above a planet none of them had ever heard of, carrying 2 exhausted survivors who had done everything humanly possible to finally bring that chain to an end. It did not end. It simply reached the 2 men who happened to be standing closest when its next link came due, exactly the way it had reached every other set of hands before them, all the way back to a scientist who only ever wanted to understand a signal coming from beneath an ancient crater. What remains worth holding on to, even inside an ending this bleak, is the specific quality of what Isaac and Carver actually chose to do with the little agency either of them had left. Neither man had any real reason to believe their efforts would succeed. Both had already lost the people who gave their lives structure and meaning. Both were operating on injuries that should have stopped them, inside an environment engineered by circumstance to kill anyone who stayed too long, chasing an objective built by a species that had already failed at it once. They finished the work anyway. Whatever the galaxy's fate turned out to be in the hours and days after that final collision, the record of this story shows 2 ordinary men, carrying more grief than either of them had processed, and less hope than the situation required, completing a task that had defeated an alien civilization, 2 human governments, and every previous survivor who had ever attempted it. That accomplishment does not undo the ending. It sits alongside it, unresolved in exactly the same way everything else in this story remains unresolved, refusing to be either a triumph or a waste. There is something almost unbearably quiet about how this story chooses to leave its 2 central survivors. No final confrontation staged for maximum spectacle. No triumphant return to a grateful, saved civilization. Simply a ship, already damaged beyond any reasonable hope of survival, struck by the exact force it had spent its entire journey trying to outrun, its lights presumably dimming the same way every other ending in this saga has dimmed before it, into silence rather than resolution. Whether Isaac, Carver, or anyone else who fought against this threat across the length of this entire saga ultimately survived what came after that final collision above Earth remains, as of this telling, a question this story leaves entirely open. What is not left open, what this ending makes unmistakably clear, is that nothing in this entire saga was ever actually finished by the people who fought hardest to finish it. It was only ever handed forward, generation after generation, institution after institution, survivor after survivor, each one carrying it a little further before running out of time, out of resources, or out of life itself, and passing whatever remained of the burden on to whoever happened to be standing there next. Somewhere above a planet that had spent 3 centuries refusing to fully reckon with what it had unleashed, the lights of one final ship dimmed against the dark, carrying 2 exhausted men, and whatever remained of everything they had fought this hard and lost this much trying to finally put to rest.